On a tiny, waterless island called Baliceaux, more than half of a deported people died within months. Yet their dead were never marked, and their story was almost erased. Begin on an island in the Eastern Caribbean. Its people call it Yurumein. On maps, it is St. Vincent, and here emerged a people who called themselves the Garínagu, known to the world as the Garifuna. They are an Afro-Indigenous people, descended from indigenous Arawak and Kalinago, the island Carib, and from Afro-Caribbean people. Their very name reportedly translates to cassava-eating people, a name rooted not in conquest, but in what they ate from the land. There is a popular story of how the African side of that ancestry arrived. Around 1635, the account goes, 2 Spanish slave ships wrecked near St. Vincent. African survivors reached the island and merged with the Caribs. It is a dramatic image, a shipwreck, survivors washing ashore, 2 worlds colliding by accident. But hold on to that story for a moment, because the closer historians and geneticists look, the more that single shipwreck starts to feel too small to explain who these people became. If they were not simply the children of one accident, then what were they? That question runs underneath everything that follows. Part 1. More than a shipwreck. The shipwreck story is memorable, but the record complicates it. The Garifuna population was continuously reinforced, not by one wreck, but by maroons, people escaping slavery on neighboring islands, arriving again and again over decades. This was not a single event. It was a long, steady fusion. And the relationship between the African newcomers and the indigenous people was not what colonial imagination assumed. In a 1795 report to the British Crown, Governor William Young stated something striking. The wreck survivor Africans, whom he described as largely Ibibio, were never enslaved by the Caribs. Instead, they formed independent communities that gradually integrated with the indigenous peoples. Think about what that means. On islands surrounded by the machinery of Caribbean slavery, a free Afro-Indigenous society was taking shape on its own terms. That independence was exactly what made them a threat. A free people who answered to no plantation, who held their own land and their own weapons. The British colonial project could not simply absorb them. And so the question shifted from who the Garifuna were to whether an empire would let them exist at all. Part 2. Chatoyer and the Fall. That confrontation had a name, Joseph Chatoyer, known to his people as Chatoyer. He led Garifuna resistance against British expansion on St. Vincent. This was not a footnote skirmish. The 1773 treaty that followed the First Carib War was the first that Britain was forced to sign with non-white people in the Caribbean since the 1739 Jamaican Maroon Treaty, an empire compelled to negotiate as if with equals. But treaties held only as long as they were convenient. Chatoyer was killed on 14th of March 1795. The resistance he led was broken. After defeat by the British in 1796 and 1797, roughly 5,000 Garifuna were deported from the only homeland they had ever known. And here is where the story reaches its darkest point. They were first held on Baliceaux, a tiny, waterless island. On that barren ground, more than half of them died. From starvation, from disease, from exposure. Of the thousands taken there, only about 2,500 survived to be shipped onward. The dead of Baliceaux were never officially marked, never excavated. An entire generation lost on an island with no water and no grave. How does a people survive that? And what carries across the sea with the ones who live? Part 3. 2,000 survivors. The survivors were shipped to Roatán in the Bay Islands of Honduras. The anthropologist Michael Crawford records the precise number that arrived in 1797, 2,026 Black Caribs, deported to the Bay Islands. 2,000 people. That is the entire genetic and cultural seed of everything the Garifuna would become. Crawford described them as a biological and cultural amalgam of Amerindians and West Africans. Not a diluted remnant, but a distinct people carrying two heritages at once. What happened next is one of the most remarkable demographic recoveries on record. From that small founding population, the community grew. Crawford documented growth to roughly 70,000, and he measured something extraordinary along the way, one of the highest recorded fertility levels in the world, a mean of 10.9 children per woman aged 45 and older. Numbers like that are how a nearly erased people refuses erasure. But survival is not only about how many are born. It is about what they carry with them, the language, the drum, the memory of Yurumein. And here the recovery becomes not just a story of bodies, but of culture holding its ground. From Roatán, the Garifuna spread into Honduras, Belize, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. Wherever they settled, they preserved their language, their drumming, their dance, and an ancestor-centered spirituality that keeps the dead present among the living. This was not assimilation. It was a portable homeland, carried in sound and ceremony. The world eventually recognized what they had protected. In 2001, UNESCO proclaimed Garifuna language, dance, and music a masterpiece of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. A people once loaded onto ships to be forgotten had preserved something the world now names as a treasure of humanity. Today, the Garifuna number an estimated 600,000 globally. They traditionally speak an Arawakan language, the tongue of their indigenous ancestors, alive in the mouths of the descendants of survivors. And the diaspora keeps moving. The largest Garifuna community in the United States is in the Bronx, in New York. Back home, memory is honored too. On 14th of March 2002, Joseph Chatoyer was named St. Vincent's first national hero, and each year a pilgrimage returns to Baliceaux, to the island whose dead were never marked. But there was still one question the history books alone could not answer. How much of that indigenous homeland actually survives inside the people themselves? Part 4. The Hidden Ancestry in the DNA. That is where genetics enters, carefully and with humility. Peer-reviewed research on St. Vincent and Trinidad communities looked at inherited lineages, the DNA passed down through mothers and through fathers. The maternal line, mitochondrial DNA, tells one part of the story. On St. Vincent, the indigenous maternal haplogroup A2 made up about 16% of samples, and C1 about 21%. In Trinidad, A2 rose to about 42%, and C1 to about 17%. Across the studied St. Vincent Garifuna and Trinidad First Peoples communities, 46% carried indigenous maternal ancestry. These are not shallow, recent lineages. The A2 lineages were dated to roughly 8,189 years, and C1 to roughly 2,452 years, deep roots reaching far back into the indigenous past. The non-indigenous maternal lineages were mostly African, L0, L1, L2, L3, with L2 the most common among Vincentians. Then came the paternal side, and a genuine surprise. Researchers detected an indigenous Y chromosome, QM3, in St. Vincent, reported as the first discovery of indigenous Y chromosomes in Caribbean Antillean populations. The remaining paternal lineages were African, E1B1A, or European. This is a sex-biased ancestry. Indigenous lines carried strongly through mothers, African and European lines predominantly through fathers, with rare indigenous paternal survival too. It is worth being precise about what this means and what it does not. DNA does not rank peoples, and it does not overrule a community's own memory of itself. What it does here is confirm, in independent evidence, what the Garifuna have long said, that their indigenous ancestry never vanished. The shipwreck story was never the whole truth. Part 5. What the story itself says. Step back and look at the full arc. A people formed on Yurumein from indigenous and African ancestry, reinforced not by one accident, but by generations of the free and the escaped. A people who forced an empire to sign a treaty, who followed Chatoyer, who were defeated and deported and left to die on a waterless island, where their dead lie unmarked to this day. And from barely 2,000 survivors, a nation of some $600,000 spread across 5 countries and beyond, holding a language, a drum, and a spirituality the world has named a masterpiece. The genetics does not sensationalize any of this. It quietly agrees with the memory the Garifuna carried all along. The deep indigenous maternal lineages, thousands of years old. The rare indigenous Y chromosome that scientists had never before found in the Antilles. These are not a reveal that corrects the community from the outside. They are a confirmation from a second witness. The lesson is not that DNA discovered who the Garifuna are. It is that the Garifuna already knew, and kept knowing, through deportation, famine, and exile, and the science simply caught up. A people the historical record nearly reduced to a shipwreck footnote turned out to be one of the most resilient acts of cultural survival in the Americas. If any part of this history, displacement, loss, or intergenerational trauma, weighs on you, please reach out to a trusted local mental health service or community support line in your country. Honoring these histories is easier when we care for ourselves and each other.